Hello, my name is Gary Kurutz, and I'm a volunteer at the wonderful Center for Sacramento History. And I've had the privilege of working with Ken Hayden, who is the chief archivist there at the center. And before that, I had a long career in rare books and special collections before I retired. And previously, I was executive director of the California State Library Foundation and curator of special collections at the California State Library since 1980. And then prior to that, I was the library director for the California Historical Society in San Francisco. And I'm also was a curator of Western Americana at the Henry E. Huntington Library in San Marino, which has a distinguished rare book and history collection too. And I've also been involved with a number of historical organizations, including the California Historical Society, as a past president of the Book Club of California, and I belong to a number of bibliophilic groups like the Zamorano Club in Los Angeles and the Roxburgh Club in San Francisco. And these are all groups of men and women who love rare books and love fine printing. And had some books published through them. I did one on bibliography of the California Gold Rush and a wonderful pictorial history of Gladys McBean, the architectural terracotta company. It's not too far from the center up in Lincoln. So it's been a great privilege to work with all this just really fabulous material. But it's also been very exciting to work with the collection of Eleanor Grace McClatchy. And she's certainly a distinguished and wonderful rare book collector. But as I'd have to say in my line of work, particularly being San Francisco oriented, relatively unknown in the collecting world. And she's just, it was very impressive going through the lists of some of the things that she had acquired for the center. And she has a long, great history with Sacramento. It goes all the way back to her grandfather, who in 1857, Charles McClatchy, started the Sacramento Bee. And before that, he had actually worked for the city's first newspaper, the Placer Times, and then started his own newspaper again back in the 1850s, that raucous, rambunctious time period. There are all kinds of newspapers started in California. One historian called California a graveyard of newspapers because so many of them started and collapsed. But the Bee still continues to this very day, and it has one of the most distinguished and actually the longest continuously operating newspaper in California. And so, and Eleanor again succeeded her father, who became ill, and asked her to take over the running of the Bee. And she was actually hoping to go into the theater arts, and she wanted to be a playwright and had been educated in the East Coast, and she was working on a advanced degree writing plays at the distinguished Columbia University in New York City. But her dad called her back and said, Eleanor Grace, it's time for you to come back to Sacramento and take over running the Sacramento Bee. And it also included the big empire, too, of the Fresno Bee and the Modesto Bee and a number of other smaller newspapers and some radio stations and one television station. So this was a big job to take on, but she succeeded in running the Bee for 37 years. So did a really, I think she's one of the most remarkable women executives in 20th century California and Western history, too. And I can't think of anyone else that would have exceeded her. There was Estelle Doheny down in Los Angeles, but she wasn't, she was a great collector and managed a big financial empire. But I think what Eleanor did was so diverse, and, she had to understand journalism and, understand it right away. Of course, she had the family background. But because of that, she immediately had to jump in and learn how to do it very quickly. But she quickly obtained the support of the staff there, and they all loved her and adored her. And the reminiscences about her talk about what a wonderful caring lady she was over the years, and developing the staff, and making sure everyone on the staff was okay. So and she did things too, like she built new buildings for all three of those newspapers. And she also established a cafeteria at the Sacramento Bee building, and and made it available, of course, for staff, so they'd have a good, friendly place to eat their lunches or take breaks with, coffee and what have you. And she would frequently go in and said, "Would you mind if I sat next to you?" And so she would, enter into conversations with her staff, and so she developed a real rapport with staff members that way too. So again, she knew how to build loyalty and knew how to motivate them to do the best they could for the bee. But with her great family legacy too, she knows that her roots, she's still in Sacramento, but go all the way back into pioneer days in Sacramento with her grandfather. And because of that, she developed a keen interest in California history, and in particular, the California Gold Rush, because Sacramento was, after all, a town developed out of the gold rush, with Captain Sutter being not too far away over at Sutter's Fort, but it was, again, his employee, James Wilson Marshall, who discovered gold there on January 24th, 1848, up by Coloma. Saw something shining in the ditch, and his another employee, Sam Brannan, came running and back, gold, gold, gold on the Sacramento River, and that started it all off. And of course, people started a great, not only rush for gold, but rush for publishing, and also, had to develop pamphlets and founded newspapers, all to spread the word that California was indeed the Golden State. And because of that, she developed a great affection and knowledge of California history. I mean, that was part of growing up, was with her family, was learning about California. And early on in her career, she started collecting pioneer California newspapers. And so, started out with, of course, the Placer Times and early editions of the Sacramento Bee, again, going back to 1857. So, and then she would collect the Californian, which was actually the very first newspaper published in California back in 1846 in Monterey, and then the Alta California, which was San Francisco's first great newspaper, and on and on. And so it's just, that got her bug going for collecting. And you have an affliction, which I also have. It's called bibliomania. Or it could be a bibliomaniac, and she was indeed that. And so she knew how, she had a great eye for things. And with her father, too, did trips to Europe and to Egypt and other places, and even into the Orient. And so naturally, when you go to these places, you probably see some, antiquarian bookstores, and she could not resist going in and maybe picking out some things and telling her, "Dear father, I think this would be good for us to take back home." So she built a tremendous collection that way, and it's just so wonderful that it's at the Center for Sacramento History, where it is truly appreciated, and we're going to make it as accessible as possible. And Kim, you're the chief cataloger there too, so you'll be able to get all these wonderful biblio prizes cataloged and up online. So.
Well, I couldn't do it without you doing the inventory, which you've been working on for the past two and a half years.
2.5 years, yes. And it's been truly wonderful because, open up a box, it's in your wonderful protected stacks there, but you just don't know what you're going to find. And so it's wonderful. You feel like you're, treasure hunting, and you feel like you're going into King Tut's tomb, but except it's you're looking at books, and that was so special. And you pull out something, oh, look at this. Here's Isaiah Thomas's history of printing, and that was the first history of printing about the 13 colonies, and it's a first edition. So you just, run across wonderful things like that. And of course, Eleanor was interested in establishing a printing museum, but unfortunately, she passed away before that could happen, but she did provide funds to establish the Sacramento History Museum, and where they took the entranceway from the old Sacramento Bee building. It's there on the first floor as you enter into the museum. And it has the printing presses and things that she collected. So in one way, she did, live on through that legacy in that museum, but she also left her wonderful rare book collection to the center. And so her legacy will be continue on that way, and we're going to do the best we can to make the scholarly world know about Eleanor as a wonderful collector. So anyhow, and she also, I learned too, going through some of the files you have there, I saw immediately an inventory done by John Howell Books. And they, John and Warren Howell, his son, were the most distinguished booksellers in the Western United States. They're antiquarian booksellers. And they had their shop on the 400 block of Post Street, not coincidentally, right across the street from the St. Francis Hotel. And, and just a half a block away from the Union Square there. And it just was a great location. All the important visitors to San Francisco would come to that location, and then they'd walk up Post Street and see John Howell Books. And his son Warren continued the family legacy, and had a beautiful, beautiful shop. I loved going in there. It was designed by Bernard Maybeck, the great architect. It had long, long corridor, and they just all lined with books 2 stories high. And Warren had his office right at the very end. There's a door there, but he could see all the way down, so he could see everybody that was coming in. And he had a wonderful staff too, but and people would say, and how can we help you? And, well, I just want to see some books. So and he had a wonderful secretary by the name of Sally Zeisser, and she was so good in greeting people too. But it's interesting too, since I've told some of my antiquarian bookseller friends in San Francisco about working on this collection, they said, "Oh, I've met Eleanor McClatchy. I remember selling her books, when we worked for John Howell Books." So I've run into a couple of people that way. John Wendell in particular had a very good, fond memory of Eleanor and her expertise. But Warren was really the dean of rare book dealers in the Western United States, and only maybe somebody perhaps in Chicago or New York would rival him, but I consider him one of the great booksellers in the world. And he helped shape Eleanor collecting, and to point things out. Or back then, you might send her a telegram or telephone call, say, got something you might be interested in the shop. And I know that she must have made numerous trips to San Francisco. Maybe she did stay at the St. Francis Hotel, and see if we can go through her financial records and see if we can find something there. But she had a keen eye, and but was very eclectic too in her collecting. As I mentioned before, she was keenly interested in California history, but she, with her interest too in printing history, with her family legacy, she collected all kinds of books on the history of printing worldwide. And she acquired books on the history and the technology of printing, and she would buy books that included all kinds of different, their type specimen books that would include that various printers would issue, that they have various fonts of type available for sale, and they'd have a book that they would reprint where they reproduce these various type fonts and ornaments, that sort of thing. So she would buy those, and but she also appreciated the history of printing, and I think the oldest thing she had was something that was actually printed in Japan in 770 AD, and so that preceded Johann Gutenberg. And speaking of Gutenberg too, she also acquired an original leaf from the Gutenberg Bible, and it's called a Noble Fragment. And somebody found a beat up copy, if you will, of the Gutenberg Bible, and it was falling apart, and took it apart in sold individual leaves from it, and they had it very nicely preserved and mounted and put in a beautiful binding, and she acquired one of those. And again, that was printed in 1455 by Johann Gutenberg. And we don't have an exact date for the Bible, but again, that was the first book printed with movable type and was one of the great advances in communication, because with a book that you can print many copies for, then you could spread literacy throughout, at that time, Western Europe and then across the world. So it was as important back then as the internet is today as far as communication is concerned. So she has a beautiful example from the Gutenberg Bible. And it's called the 42-line Bible, because that's how each page had 42 lines of text in 2 columns. So that was a wonderful acquisition. And she also got a leaf book from William Caxton, who wrote or printed the Recueil de History of Troy, which was the first book printed in English in 1475. And Caxton was in France at the time and learning the art of printing. And so she acquired that. So a number of other great examples are in her collection, but she also appreciated the Renaissance, and she acquired and purchased some beautiful examples of illuminated manuscripts, usually 1 page or 2, but they're all gorgeously illuminated. That is with hand coloring of initials, and then they used gold leaf and lapis lazuli, and the text was actually written on vellum or sheepskin, and like some of the old college diplomas. So these were just great examples to show people and share with people the beauty of how the written word came into printing. And so these are just so exciting to see in the collection. And again, with her, she appreciated what was going on too. Before I get to California, I wanted to mention too that she acquired some materials that were printed by the 4 Gospels, printed by William Morris. And he was just 3 volumes of beautiful work done on handmade paper. And he was one of the revivers of or started the arts and crafts movement. And again, he was working in England at turn of the previous century, and there's kind of a revolt against the Industrial Revolution. And you're churning out all this cheap material, not only machine-wise, but with the printing presses, they are printing things in quantity, but usually on very cheap, high-acid paper, and it would fall apart very quickly. So there was kind of a reaction against that. So he started a printing press, and he used his own skills to set 1 letter at a time, and use an old hand press and produce some beautiful books. And he employed an artist by the name of Edward Burne Jones, and he did great work. So that's some of the examples too of things that Eleanor was keenly interested in, the arts and crafts movement and some of these wonderful books. And she also collected miniature books, and it's a very good area. There's an organization called the Miniature Book Society of America, and these books should be no taller than 3 inches to be classified as a miniature book. But she had one where they took leaves from old books and inserted them in there, and it just is a tremendous work to see these things. And there's one that's a beautiful accordion fold too. So it just is, and these will be on display at the History Museum once we get opened again. So but again, she collected too, great works of California history, and naturally the California Gold Rush, of course, was intriguing to her, and she purchased a number of very rare accounts by some of the people that came to California and then went back home, and I wrote up their descriptions, and they said there's gold enough for millions and millions of people there. Gold is where you find it, though. So that forms a nice part of the collection as well. So I should mention too, years ago I did a bibliography of eyewitness accounts of the California Gold Rush, published by the Book Club of California. And before they published it, I asked Jim Henley, the former executive director of the center, I said, would I be able to get access to Eleanor McClatchy's collection? Because it was then in her home there. Where is it located on, was it Poverty Ridge? I forget the name of that neighborhood there, but ironic name. But I went into the home and there was this beautiful room all loaded with these great books. And that was a real thrill to see that. And fortunately, those have all been brought to the center, and they're there for you to catalog and need inventory. So just really, really great. But again, being interested in printing history, she acquired what is called the Figueroa Manifiesto, which was the first book printed in California. And it was printed by Augustin V. Zamorano in 1835. And it is a defense of the governor's administration. And the reason why Governor Figueroa wrote this was because people were attacking him because there was a colonization scheme called Ihar Padres colonization party that came in after the missions had been secularized, and they thought they were entitled to claim mission lands. And Governor Figueroa disagreed with that. And so the secretary, Zamorano, agreed to print a pamphlet that his boss had written, but he didn't have a printing press. But then a ship called the Lagoda from New England arrived, and after going to Hawaii, came over to Monterey, and that was the main embarcadero for California at the time, and it had a printing press on board. And Zamorano negotiated with the state captain to get that printing press in its type. So it's a ramage press, is made out of wood, but it was kind of one of the early predecessors of what we have, and brought it on, on shore, and he used it to print that very first book. And the challenge that Zamorano had was that it came with an English language typeface, not Spanish, and naturally came from New England, but he had to adapt that. And so so if you look at the title page, you see some places where it should have accent marks and things, but what he did is he's ingenious, like in Spanish, they have a tilde over ends, and so what he did is he took a comma and welded it on top of the ends. So it looks like a tilde. So he's able to print that way, but too, California was going through a tumultuous time, revolutions back and forth. And so General Vallejo got a hold of the press and took it up to his ranch there in Northern California to use it to print it, some things. And then it was brought back to Monterey again, and then the Americans raised their flag there. And a guy by the name of Walter Colton and another man by the name of Robert Semple said, we can use this press to print a newspaper. And Walter Colton is famous. He wrote a wonderful account of California. And Colton Hall in Monterey is named in his honor. That's where California Constitutional Convention was held, established statehood. And Robert Semple was a very interesting guy too, because he's probably the tallest man in California. He was 6'7" in height. People used to kid him when he ride his mule because his feet would drag on the ground. But they're very, very skilled typographers, printers, writers. So their very first issue was called, newspaper was called The Californian. Came out on August 15th, 1846. And it had news about the American takeover. And there used to be kind of a folklore about that first issue, and that it was, said paper was so scarce in Monterey that they had to use cigarette wrapping paper to print it on.
You think that's true?
But actually, they did have several reams of paper that came over on that New England merchant ship, so they're able to use that. But Eleanor did get some copies of the Californian, so it's a wonderful, not only for the information, of course, it's been digitized, but it's a wonderful artifact in itself. And then that same press was taken up to San Francisco to print its first newspaper. And then later on, in 1857, came to Sacramento and was used to print the Placer Times, Sacramento's first newspaper, I should say. It was earlier in 1857, I was thinking about the Bee, of course. But then from there, it went down to Stockton to print that city's, the old Tullibird, as it used to be called, Stockton Times. And then it went down to Sonora to print that city's Gold Rush town's first newspaper. So it had a distinguished heritage. But unfortunately, the press got involved in a dispute. And on the main street there in Sonora, somebody set it on fire and destroyed California's, I think, greatest printing artifact ever. It would have been so great if that printing press would have still be preserved and would have been in Eleanor's museum, hopefully. So
I can imagine her purchasing that.
Yes, I can well imagine her doing that. So, but again, she, was so eclectic in her collecting, but she loved Californiana. And so she acquired early pamphlets, not only the Zamorano imprint that I mentioned, but some things documenting California's mission heritage. There's a book by Francisco Salas defending his administration as in charge of the missions at one time, and many other Gold Rush era pamphlets, that sort of thing, and some of the political events, and and then general California history. So it's not only rarities, but also to have a good working knowledge of California. In addition to that, she acquired, how can you resist? I know Warren Howell would have things like this. These wonderful bird's eye views of California cities that were done in the 1850s. And Center, thanks to Eleanor, has a wonderful collection of those. And also another thing is called pictorial letter sheets. And these would have a California scene printed on them, usually wood engraving or sometimes a lithograph. And the idea was, it's kind of the predecessor of the postcard, is that the person that owned the letter sheet would write a letter home and then send it back to New England or to Virginia or wherever to say, this is what Sacramento looks like. And, this is where I'm living. This is where I'm making my living. Or, a gold camp, Coloma, and, some of the other Placerville, what have you. So it would be all portrayed this way. So it's a great visual record of California during that, rambunctious decade of the 1850s. So and those things are extremely, extremely rare. I personally have gone to a couple of auctions of pictorial letter sheets, and they fetch very high prices at auction, because they're so rare. And most of them are blank. They have a picture on them, but no letters. And that's because I think way back then, people saw them as a keepsake and preserved them. And then, of course, every town, in a major town or city in California in the 1850s had, great destructive events like fires. San Francisco had 7 fires in the 1850s, and Sacramento had a few fires, and also something called the flood too. So that, wiped out a lot of original material. But a lot of this is preserved, and thanks to people like Eleanor and her passion that California is, I think, has the most fascinating history of any state in the Union. And I think we need to thank Eleanor Grace McClatchy for that. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, she not everyone could live forever. She died at the age of 80, but again, left collection and money to build that great museum, which is now the centerpiece, I think, of Old Town Sacramento. And so, Eleanor, thank you for all that you've done in preserving California history.
She's pretty great. So you were talking about going through the boxes while you've been doing the inventory you've been working on at the center, and opening a box and not quite knowing what's going to be in there and there being a nice surprise. What are some of the things that you've come across that you were most excited about? Or you went, ooh, you opened a box.
Yeah, no, what I love California photography, and she had in one of the boxes Hittel's guidebook to the Yosemite Valley. And that was actually printed in 1868 and published in 1868. And it was the first guidebook to Yosemite Valley. But what really makes it interesting too is that Hittel hired a photographer by the name of Edward Muybridge to illustrate his book. And the way they did that back then is they had no means of reproducing photographs for a book. So what you did is you told somebody like Mr. Muybridge, I'm going to do X amount of copies, and we're going to have 12 illustrations in it. And so you need, if it's 100 copies, I'll need 1,200 photographs to be pasted into the blank sheets in the book. And so that's how it was done back then. And it's so nice to find that, because that's really one of the hallmarks of California publishing history, but also the history of photography, because Muybridge was the one who was the founder of the motion picture. And he was the one that did the studies of animals and human figures in motion. He developed a way to have multiple cameras to show people walking, horses running. And as you know, he worked with Leland Stanford, and when a horse runs, do all four legs leave the ground at the same time? And he set up cameras to prove, yes, they did. And he, during the great World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he set up what's called a zoopraxisgraphical hall. And his camera was called a zoopraxiscope. And that was actually the first movie theater anywhere in the world. And it was thanks to Edward Muybridge. So that was just one example of some of the great things in there. The Golden Legend of William Caxton and Done Anew. And this was done by, William Morris, and just, with his own Kelmscott Press, as it was called. And so they did, Caxton again was England's first printer. And so this was, these beautiful initial letters that just make it, some people say in the art of the, there's a book called Art of the Printed Book, and it said, quote, Morris's passion and craftsmanship was the spark which ignited a 50-year renaissance of bookmaking in England and on the continent and in the United States. And then that other one too, the Four Gospels, that was done by Eric Gill, and he was just an outstanding craftsman, and he designed the type and he illustrated it with all these woodcuts, wood engravings that he himself had done, and he made these, we'll have that on display too, these beautiful letters, but he would show animals and human figures wrapped around the letters, and they are just so dramatic. And so I just love the fact that she was able to acquire copies of things of that nature. So and as I mentioned before, she acquired some of the standard great books of the California Gold Rush and the Gutenberg Bible Leaf, and and then another one that she acquired was the scenes of Rocky Mountain scenery, who was illustrated. Was written by
A.V. Hayden. Is it A.V.?
Oh yeah, Ferdinand V. I don't know why his name.
Hayden. I mean, I know. I remember
Hayden, right?
Yeah, remember that.
One of your ancestors, right?
Yeah.
And just that was, A.J. Russell was his photographer. Yes, and it came back to me his name. And anyhow, that book is illustrated with 30 original photographs of the expedition across the continent from the eastern. From basically the Mississippi River out towards California rather than the other way around, and it just beautifully illustrated with his photographs showing the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad, and going through the Rocky Mountains and then down in the flatlands into Utah. There's a gorgeous view of Salt Lake City showing the Mormon Tabernacle, and then up over into the Sierra. So it's again one of the hallmarks of book illustration, and that's a very, very rare copy. He did 100 copies of that. So that's a tremendous production too, because again, you had to mount thousands and thousands of photographs, 30 photographs for 100 copies. That's do the multiplication, and that's a lot of copies. And so there's another one that I just love. It's James or Joseph LeConte's Excursions of the University excursion party, and they went 12 students went into the High Sierra and then into Yosemite with LeConte, who was a professor there at the University of California. And if you go down to UCLA, there's a very important street right parallels the campus called LeConte. That's where the name comes from. So but anyhow, he wrote up his account of the university students going to Yosemite, and they met a very interesting man there. Whoops, I don't know how that happened, but by the name of John Muir, and got an introduction into the valley from none other than John Muir, and cannot think of a better tour guide of Yosemite than John Muir. But these books were also illustrated with original photographs. Unfortunately, LeConte did not give the name of his photographer, but we think it was J.J. Riley, who was the first photographer to actually have a studio in Yosemite Valley. But it's a beautiful, beautiful work. So, things of that nature that you run across that just, make my eyes go wide, and you think, wow, what a great, fabulous treasure to have here. So anyhow, that's, gives you an idea of the joy of that, and just getting into, some of these other, masterful histories of book illustration, or just even world history. And there was another one too that on the shelves there in your closed stacks was Cornelia Whitecliffe's atlas. It's the first atlas to depict or delineate North America, and that was done in 1597. And what I love about it too is that it shows the coastline of California, and it shows California as part of the mainland, because a lot of people used to think California was an island. But what I like about it too, from my viewpoint, because I love legends and folklore, is that it showed the 7 cities of gold.
Right.
And that's what triggered the Francisco Coronado expedition, because they heard that there was immense wealth somewhere in North America. And, the Native Americans would say, well, El Capitan's just over the next hill. And so the expedition searched and searched and searched for the 7 cities of gold. And one day they saw a pueblo, and the way the sun was on it, they said, there it is. They thought it was the way the sun shined on the color of the adobe. They thought that's gold, but it turned out
Disappointment.
it wasn't there. But it's it's such a wonderful, wonderful map, again, showing what Spain knew about the New World and depicting both North and South America. And that was it's a huge atlas, it's about 3 feet high, and but seeing it there on the shelves and said, wow, let's take a look at this. And again, this is before too, they knew how to print in color. So when you're working in the 16th century, the only way, and this map is just beautifully colored, and it had to all be colored by hand. And all the way up until the most of the 19th century, you had to color things by hand. So it's only until the chromolithograph came along that did you have the first color printing. So it's just such a joy to find these things in this beautiful, beautiful collection. And we want to again call attention to the prowess and expertise and enthusiasm of Eleanor Grace McClatchy in acquiring books and having them placed in such a great environment as a Center for Sacramento History. Just establishes again the cultural prominence of Sacramento too.
Did you know about the collection? Did you know about her collection before you started working on it? Is it known to collectors?
No, it is not.
Right, because she was a really private person.
Yes, she was, yeah. And so, she did a marvelous job of management, as I indicated earlier on. But, working as I did for many years in San Francisco, book circles, and no one ever talked about Eleanor McClatchy. And it's only when I moved up here to Sacramento to work at the State Library, but I remember running into a bookseller by the name of Wendell Hammond, and he had a shop right on Front Street in an antiquarian bookstore right on Front Street in Old Town Sacramento. And he talked about Eleanor McClatchy and said, "Oh, the McClatchy collection." So that was the first I really heard of it. And, I knew, of course, about then it was called Sacramento History Center. And, and talking to Jim Henley, the former executive director there, talked about Eleanor's collection, but not so much the books. And, it was more known for, the manuscripts and bird's eye views and that sort of thing. These are real museum pieces, and a number of them are on display at the museum, but not so much the book collection. So, and I also belong to an organization called the Sacramento Book Collectors Club. And I hope I'm not offending anybody, but in all my meetings, I'm the past president of that organization too. No one ever really talked too much about, or at all, about Eleanor McClatchy as a book collector. So I understand this club is now interested in her.
I
so,
bet. So
yeah.
that's neat. So when you came in to start working on the inventory, everything was new to you.
Yes,
so
it was.
you were finding things, you had no idea you were going to be finding that thing.
Finding, yes.
That's so cool. That makes it even more fun.
Yeah, no, it.
Wonder you're enjoying this
and
so
just,
much.
Again, going through that list too that the John Howell books had compiled. And it started going through the titles there. And I thought, oh, goodness, are these still here? I hope they are.
Yeah.
And going back, and there they are. So it, that was just such a, they're well preserved and everything, but that was so exciting, and just bringing them out to show you and to show Marcia Hyman, and just, wow, this is,
And I should say that list from Howell's books is about this thick paper, single printed, handwritten. And that is so far the only inventory we have. So Gary is making us a digital inventory. So yeah, having a paper handwritten inventory is less helpful than what we're going to have.
Right, yes. Yeah, so we do want, scholars to know about this collection too. So that, so hopefully we can get the word out there, and then again with online cataloging and what have you, people will find it on sources like the OCLC and the WorldCat and things of that nature too. So that'll draw more people into the center to do research. It's such a wonderful collection. But again, to know too, because I had a personal relationship with him, to know that Warren Howell and his staff had actually done the inventory of this collection, which just added a lot of, emotion to me too. So it just was so exciting to go through this inventory and see, wow, there's one great piece after another. So
that's great. We're so lucky.
No, we really are. Just to, again, you feel like we've discovered things, and it's been there for years, and just the center's had so many things, more pressing issues to work on, and having to move and things of that nature, getting the museum established. And but again, Eleanor's memory is well enshrined there too in the museum too. So
well, yeah, and it's exciting too that she helped get that museum created. And now we're going to have an exhibit open, which was scheduled to open the week that everything got shut down.
Yes, right.
So it will open when we open again, but we have it all set up, ready to go, of Eleanor's rare books, maps, and letter sheets, many of which we talked about today will be on display. And Gary, who co-curated it, did a fabulous job. So we loved having your expertise.
Yeah, well, it's been such a joy working with you too. It really has. And
yeah,
the entire staff there at the center. It's been a great
We'll get to return again one day.
Yeah, let's hope. Yes, we're going to come up with a vaccine. So
I know. All right. Do you have anything else?
back in the gold rush, they had cholera epidemics in Sacramento. So
That's right. Yeah, we can handle this. If they can handle cholera, we can handle this.
Yeah, we can handle it. Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So.
Okay. Well, do you have any other last words about Eleanor?
No, well, just that she was such a unselfish lady, and again inspired her staff, and and again a woman back at that time period. What was it, 1947 that she had to take over the B.
No, I think
I forget the exact date.
1936.
Excuse me.
Yeah,
1936 that she took over the B, and that's following the Great Depression, and to have to manage such a large publishing empire, not only the three B's as they call them, but the TV station, the radios, all that sort of thing. And she did
and
do
be a woman doing it.
And to be a woman, yeah, that's my point too. And to have, but she, again, was so good a manager that she had a highly motivated staff. And they didn't, make, say, well, we're not going to take orders from a person like that.
Right.
Who does she think she is, kind of? So but because of her, I think the McClatchy name is one of the great names in the history of journalism, and I think in many ways the most famous name in Sacramento, other than maybe Sutter. It just, or some governors may argue, but but I think as far as community building, because she was also interested in the theater arts. She herself, did the Sacramento Civic Theater, and helped foster production of plays and concerts, and help others, high schools, what have you, stage events, that sort of thing, and put up money to help for preservation purposes. So she was, she was the Lorenzo de Medici of Sacramento.
Indeed.
She had such a huge cultural influence on the city that we owe her a lot. And we want her name to be really immortalized. She deserves it. So I'm hoping she's smiling at us from up above.
Or saying, stop talking about me.
No, but she needs to be credited.
She does.
And again, even the book collecting world was very much of a man's world too back then.
Yeah.
So we just most organizations, even some of these bibliographic organizations, were all dominated by men. And even today, I just saw a movie called Booksellers about the Antiquarian Book Fair in New York, and they said it's still dominated by men. And for every 2 women, there are 8 guys involved. And so so she was a real pioneer and for her the gentle gender. So
yeah.
So no, she was just fabulous. So and we have again a lot to thank her for. So and she had seen she was very cognizant too of World War II and helping Sacramento area veterans too once they got back from that horrible war, and helping them, and just on and on with her charitable pursuits too. So that she was a whirlwind of activity. So but such a skilled manager that she could do multi-purpose things at one time. So she just so admired, and she helped with publishing. She did a centennial history of the bee, and helped with the County Historical Society too, getting out an illustrated history of Sacramento. So so she and her legacy is so important to us. So that's what I'm saying. Thank you, Eleanor. Grace McClatchy.
You can think about it. Chad's going to edit this.